All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a really close look at Michael Parenti's highly provocative book, Blackshirts and Reds. We're going to break down his rather controversial, class-based analysis of 20th century history, and we'll also see how a few other prominent voices totally echo his theories on power, wealth, and systemic control.
To these authors, history itself is basically a battleground. As the Latin American writer Eduardo Galeano puts it, just remembering alternative historical narratives is a deeply subversive radical act. When we peeled back the layers and look closely at the forces shaping our society, our jobs, and our governments, these writers argue that the official narrative is often masking a much deeper class-based struggle.
So here's our roadmap for the overview. We're going to hit rational fascism, left anti-communism, working class resistance, siege socialism, and finally capitalist restoration. Let's just objectively examine how these authors view the hidden economic forces that they say dictate modern history.
Starting off with Section 1, Rational Fascism and Corporatism.
Mainstream history usually paints the fascism of the 1920s and 30s as this bizarre, irrational madness that just suddenly swept across Europe. But Parenti's book strongly disagrees. He defines what he calls rational fascism. He sees it as a highly calculated political tool, essentially a false revolution designed specifically to lock down the interests of massive corporate wealth. According to his analysis, it functioned as a brutal final solution to the class struggle, heavy-handedly repressing working-class resistance just to protect industrialists and bankers.
And this brings us right to a core debate. You've probably heard of the totalitarian twins myth. That's the mainstream idea that fascism and communism are basically equal evils because they're both authoritarian. While Parenti's class counter-narrative pushes back, arguing that they're actually fundamental opposites. Why? Because when you look at who actually owns the wealth, fascism is all about preserving private capital and corporate hierarchies, whereas communism actively seeks to abolish them.
Expanding on this, we can look at the prison writings of George Jackson. Jackson asserted that American fascism is basically an advanced economic arrangement. He argued that it's brilliantly disguised as reform, but its real underlying aim is neutralizing the vanguard of the people and keeping the traditional capitalist ruling class firmly in the driver's seat. Moving right along to Section 2, Challenging Left Anti-Communism. Both Parenti and our supporting authors take a really critical look at this pervasive cultural phenomenon of anti-communism. And what's fascinating is they point out this isn't just pushed by conservative elites, it's deeply ingrained even among left-leaning intellectuals. In her autobiography, Angela Davis talks about her mission to explode the anti-communist myth she saw completely paralyzing the left over in Europe. Interestingly enough, she actually found that in American working-class neighborhoods, this knee-jerk reaction wasn't always as deeply ingrained, which she felt presented a real opportunity for genuine grassroots connection.
Michael Parenti observes a very similar trend, and he famously calls it the genuflection of the left. He argues that a lot of Western leftists totally internalize anti-communist orthodoxy. Basically, to keep their own political credibility and avoid getting slammed by mainstream media, they just automatically dismissed any achievements of socialist states. To Parenti, this whole dynamic fractures the labor movement and severely weakens any real challenge to the ruling class.
Which leads us to Section 3, Working Class Resistance. So what were these anti-capitalist labor movements actually doing down on the ground that provoked such a severe pushback from the ruling class? To the lens of historians like Howard Zinn and Robin D.G. Kelley, we get a picture of immense, multiracial organizing efforts. Zinn documents how Chicago's International Working People's Association mobilized 5,000 members, using multi-language newspapers and practical labor struggles to bridge deep theoretical divides. Meanwhile, Kelley highlights this incredible fusion down in Alabama, where Black opposition culture actually merged with Marxist organizing to challenge the whole system.
Next up, Section 4, The Realities of Siege Socialism. Now, when these highly mobilized socialist movements actually achieve state power, Parenti notes they created what he terms siege socialism. This was a system born into a totally hostile world, trying to survive under constant external military and economic threats from capitalist nations. He impartially outlines the massive strides these nations made, like rapidly modernizing semi-feudal economies and providing mass housing and schooling. But he puts that right alongside what he identifies as undeniable systemic deficiencies. We're talking about rigid, unresponsive bureaucracies, a pretty much total lack of consumer goods, and a top-down planning system that really stifled technological innovation.
And it's important to note, these societies weren't just monolithic blocks. They were constantly debating their own structures internally. Susie Kim's research highlights how figures like Mao reconsidered the Paris Commune model of direct elections specifically to combat internal privilege. It was this constant, exhausting struggle.
How do you balance mass liberation and bottom-up initiative with the absolute survival necessities of having a highly centralized defensive state power?
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Imperialism and Capitalist Restoration. So, what happens when these socialist states eventually collapse under the crushing pressure of siege socialism and the global free market swoops in? Well, this builds right into Parenti's central critique of the 1990s. He claims the massive privatization of Eastern Europe functioned as a deliberate corporate plunder. Public ownership was basically dismantled and handed over to private owners at absolute garage sale prices. According to Parenti, this wasn't the liberation it was billed as, it was a massive expropriation of land and resources that completely re-impoverished the public and basically relegated these nations to third world status.
And this supposed process of capitalist expansion definitely isn't isolated to Eastern Europe. Eduardo Galeano's analysis of Latin America mirrors this exact same sentiment. He asserts that when imperialism steps in, waving the promise of free market prosperity, it actually spreads poverty even more widely. It concentrates wealth incredibly narrowly, enriching a very select few at the catastrophic expense of the colonized working class.
We have covered a massive amount of provocative theory today, taking a really comprehensive overview of Michael Parenti's intense deconstruction of 20th century history. By looking at these historical events strictly through the lens of class interests, asking who owns the wealth and who actually performs the labor, these authors are challenging us to question basically everything we take for granted about global politics. So, I want to leave you to independently ponder this. How does this framework shift the way you see the hidden economic forces shaping our world today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.